Hey everyone, and welcome to the finalist voting for the Maven Healthcare Challenge. We actually got a lot to discuss for this one, so I'll kick things off relatively quickly. The challenge objective, which is what we'll use as the criteria for the voting here, was actually the following. So for the Maven Healthcare Challenge, you'll be working as a data analyst for the American Hospital Association, a national organization that represents hospitals and their patients and acts as a source of information on healthcare issues and trends. And as part of your role, you've been asked to analyze the Hospital Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and System Survey, or HCAHPS, for the last 9 years. And the intent of the HCAHPS initiative is actually to provide a standardized survey instrument for measuring patients' perspectives on hospital care. And one of its three main goals is to create incentives for hospitals to improve their quality of care. So your task here is to evaluate whether the HCAHPS survey has actually been successful in accomplishing this goal by answering questions like, have hospitals' HCAHPS scores improved over the past 9 years? Are there any specific areas where hospitals have made more progress than others? Are there any major areas of opportunity remaining? And finally, what recommendations can you make to hospitals to help them further improve the patient experience? Now, if we look at the data, this contains national and state level results from 2013 to 2022 for, again, the HCAHPS survey, including hospital level completions and response rates. And this is where things start to get a little bit interesting, particularly due to the different granularities that you can see here across the tables. So if I go to preview the data here, you'll see that again, we've got the national level results for each release, which includes the release period and the measure that was measured during that survey. We've got it broken down by state as well. So you'll see this column was added. And finally, we actually have the facility level, as you can see by the facility ID, response data with number of completed surveys for each hospital, as well as the response rate they represent. And I wanted to stay here for a bit since most people actually used the average of this response rate column as the response rate for the survey in each release period, but that's not technically the correct way to calculate this. So you'd actually have to use these two columns to calculate the number of, let's call it, issued surveys, then take the sum of the completed surveys and divide it by the sum of the issued surveys. And that would actually give you the complete response rate. Granted, it's actually not possible for the 2015 release because, as you can see, this isn't actually numeric data here with the 300 or more or the fewer than 100. But from 2016, there are real just numerical data or just numbers. So that did make this calculation possible, at least from 2016 to 2022. But unfortunately, we actually didn't see a lot of people perform the calculation this way. So that's maybe a consistent theme that you'll see even throughout some of the finalists. But that's the challenge and the data set here. You can also scroll through the submissions down here if you're interested. And if you did participate, but you don't see your entry here, just make sure to go into your project settings and select the Maven Healthcare Challenge. Now, we've already got a list of the 5 finalists that we're going to be evaluating today, but I'd also like to call out some 5 honorable mentions really quick. So first up, we've got Dennis here, who had a really clear flow, I think, between his 4 visuals that dove a little bit deeper into his insights after each step. We've also got Botagos here, who made a really clear and concise dashboard, I think, that focuses on both the national and the state level results while also adding some interactivity. We've got Yasmin, who used a great combination of the Likert scale for most recent results and compared it to the results of 2015, which was the beginning of this survey period in the dataset. Now, Mohammed outlined 3 very distinct phases in the 9-year period, where most people really only split it up into 2, which was the pre-COVID and the post-COVID phase. And finally, Annie Taylor made just a really polished 1-page report that showed, again, the national and the state level trends split between global measures, the measures with large drop-off, and then just the rest. So those are the honorable mentions for the Maven Healthcare Challenge. Now let's actually dig in to the 5 finalists, starting with Marianne Mellis.
Great. First, I'm going to go over Marie Ann's dashboard. Before we get into her dashboard, though, I just wanted to talk about the About This Project section. I thought she did a really great job organizing this section with the brief, the approach, and then for the key reporting areas, she goes through all the technical details. And then for this modeling section, she has a ton of questions. So I love it when I see all these questions because it means someone's really dug into the data. And at the bottom, there's even a shout out to Gerard Duggan. And I love that because it really fosters a sense of community among the Maven Challenge participants. Okay, so let's dive into the Power BI dashboard. Whenever I see a dashboard, I always start at the top left. So I love how it first just spells out the acronym, tells me what this is, it shows the date range, and then the first visualization that I see is this. And when I look at it, I think, okay, this is a great visualization, right? There's this increase, there's this post-COVID time, and there's this sharp decrease. But this is actually a part where there's a bit of lying with statistics here, because if you look at the y-axis, it doesn't start at 0. So this is something we saw a lot where we see this sharp decline, but if you had the y-axis start at 0, it would actually be kind of flat. So that's a bit of feedback on this visualization here. On this visualization on the right, this is what Enrique was just talking about. We saw this again and again, where you would see this decline in the willingness to respond, but this is an average of an average. And whenever you take an average of an average, the calculations could be wrong because you might not be weighting every row with the right weight level. So that aside, my favorite part of this whole dashboard is this bottom left, this where do we stand? Because it shows the most recent survey results, which is a great indication of what's happening currently and what can be improved. And then there's this great separation or categorization of all these measures. So we have the communication section, the discharge and care transition section, and the hospital environment. And within each of these cards, there's a ton of information. So here it shows the communication of with nurses. The top box response is 79%. So that's pretty good. And then you see the range here is for all states, the range is 70 to 84. So that shows you the variance in the data. And then shows you the top improvers and bottom performers, which I think is just really actionable because then hospitals can dig into that data and gather more insights. And one other thing I want to call out is just all these highlighted in red. So these are the stats that fall under 65% top box responses. And then this is when the decline is more than 2%. And I love that because this is so actionable. This is showing, okay, care transition is not great. Like that's something that definitely has to be improved. Or this communication about new medicine has really declined over the years. Like that needs to be looked into. And everything I'm saying has been summarized on the right over here. So I love this dashboard because I think Marianne did a great job with this KPI section on the left and then all these actual insights on the right. So great job.
All right. So next up, we have Yasmin, who put together an amazing visual. I think Yasmin really knocked this out of the park. Not surprisingly, he's a finalist. And just really quickly, I want to touch on the fact that at Maven, we love a great project write-up, and Yasmin really delivered here. Yasmin performed some pretty technical analysis, and reading through this really gave me a good sense for how Yasmin was thinking about the problem, as well as some of the technical details, which, again, when we're reviewing these projects, really helps back up the findings and give us more confidence in the analysis path that they took. So I want to call that out. I highly suggest reading this if you're interested, but let's go ahead and dive into the dashboard. There's a lot to love about Yasmin's overall visual here. First of all is that it has a very nice top to bottom logical flow. So he starts by asking a question and then talks about the metric of focus that he's going to bring into play, which is NPS. And Yasmin, as far as I'm aware, is the only finalist that use NPS as a metric, which is directly tied to the survey top response checked, middle response checked, and bottom box checked. And net promoter score specifically is the number of top boxes checked minus the percentage of bottom boxes checked to get an overall promoter score. So it's going to be very directionally close to just looking at overall satisfaction rate by looking at top box score. But NPS is an extremely popular metric in business. So I think it was very clever and prudent of Yasmin to include that as his metric. And I think that is one area where his analysis stands out. Generally speaking, I'll quickly scroll through this, but we have a very consistent visual design across this visualization. So we have key color theme, nice layout, and clear section headers that helps us navigate how Yasmin is thinking about this, as well as summarize his insights. But starting at the top level of visualizations, one thing that I really like here is that Yasmin took the time to call out the data volume in terms of the overall number of responses. So Our original data set was about 50,000 rows, but that's summarized from 22 million patients in over 5,000 hospitals, which again, when we're talking about these types of analysis, really just helps lend credibility to, hey, we can trust this data. But focusing on these visualizations, we also see a non-zero y-axis here, which is a minor sin, but again, directionally, we can see that Yasmin broke this up into a pre-COVID and post-COVID period, and we do see that all of our factors affecting hospital satisfaction have some form of decline. And so what I love about this left visual is that Yasmin has stated up front that he's focused on NPS, so we get that highlighted there with this blue. But if you are interested in other factors, and I think it helps tell a more complete story, we still can look at those individual factors affecting satisfaction. He then further summarizes this with the bar chart that shows the actual decline. So that's sort of correcting for that non-zero y-axis, but we can see the actual magnitude of those declines very clearly. And again, because we are dealing with 10 factors, Yasmin took the step of highlighting 3 factors that declined the most during this period, which again really helps us focus on this narrative and where we might want to focus the most. So overall, Net Promoter Score declined by 2.7%, with responsiveness of staff and communication about medicines declining further, lowering that average the most. And so probably my favorite section of this analysis, and I did just put out a course on regression, so I might be a little bit biased, is this section here. So this left-hand chart is a 4-quadrant view, which really breaks down the correlation of these hospital satisfaction factors to NPS, his metric of interest. And it shows the pre-COVID levels as well as post-COVID levels. And so we can see not only how correlated these are with NPS, his overall metric of interest, but how much these declined, which can really give us a good sense for where hospitals might want to focus. But Yasmin didn't stop there, and he actually built a linear regression model. And I want to say that one thing that I love about this, not only is it going to help us get the strongest insights in terms of which factors have the most impact on NPS, but his write-up of this is very intuitive for non-technical stakeholders. So one mistake that we see a lot when people present models is very technical jargon. One example of this is the metric R-squared. He does mention in a small text that his R-squared is 83%, but many people don't know what that means. So he was very careful in his headline to say that 4 factors account for 83% of the variability or variation in NPS, which I think really helps make that more concrete. And what we see is that care transition has one of the biggest impacts on NPS overall, as well as staff responsiveness, 2 factors that decline pretty significantly here. One other factor that declined significantly was not significant, and that is the communication about medicine. So using this regression analysis really helps float that staff responsiveness and care transition are 2 areas where hospitals need to focus on. And he did this all while adjusting for COVID-19 changes. So this gives us a little bit more concrete belief in these factors as being 2 areas for hospitals to focus on. One minor call out here is that we misspelled quietness, but that is a pretty small nitpick. Next up, he did a state-by-state analysis, and this is one area of Yasmin's visualization that I think if we were to cut any fat, it would be here. I think his analysis did a great job on focusing on the factors that contribute to NPS, and this is a state-by-state NPS analysis. So it is useful in the sense that we can look and see which states performed well and not well, but the rest of this analysis is centered around which factors are drivers of NPS. And this doesn't really tie too closely to those factors specifically, but it is a beautiful visualization and well thought out. And I really love the categorization of people who are drifting further away from the average post-COVID, as well as people who are thriving during COVID and making better improvements. So there is a recommendation in his roadmap to rebuilding patient trust that says, hey, let's look at Wyoming and Alaska and see what they're doing and whether we can replicate that for other hospitals. But overall, Yasmin lays out 4 key challenges as well as solutions based on the factors that he identified in his analysis, which I think is really great. These are very actionable insights. And again, this is a great summary of what the problem was at hand and what Yasmin's recommendations are, which and I think in any of our view is required for a strong analysis. And one final point I want to call out is that I really like this 4th suggestion, which he colors slightly differently. This isn't tied to factors that affect hospital performance. This is tied to the survey methodology itself. And we always want to be thinking about whether our data was collected properly. And I think Yasmin took the extra step to think about, the response timing. So this feedback is collected anywhere from 48 hours to 6 weeks after someone is discharged from a hospital. And that can affect someone's memory and whether or not they're really going to be accurately describing their experience with a hospital. So I think that's an excellent call out. It is easier said than done to get people to respond to surveys, but I think that is something that the survey organization should look at as well. So overall, really great job, Yasmin. I think this is a strong analysis.
So I am really happy to see Gabriel as a finalist in another one of our Maven challenges, and I'm really excited to walk through his project for the Maven Healthcare Challenge today. As always, I do kind of want to start by looking at this about section. I think he did a really great job with walking through his project, from explaining exactly what the objective was to his analysis. He kind of touched on the reasons that he chose specific visualizations, which I thought was a great call out. And I also thought that it was great that he kind of explained that he was honing in on 2 very specific measures rather than the entirety of the measures that were offered. In terms of something that I might like to see a little bit more here, so in a way he, talked about the measures that he was looking at, but I would really have loved to see a little bit more about what his recommendations, what his insights were, and what he might, say for the future. So I think that maybe a little bit more about conclusions and recommendations would have been a really great addition here. But overall, I thought this was really comprehensive and a great way to start off the project. Moving on to his actual visualization, there's a couple things that stood out to me right away here. I appreciated that Gabriel kind of grounded us right away in exactly what this survey is, what the purpose of the survey is. And I really do like that he only focused on these 2 measures, both the overall rating as well as the respondents' willingness to recommend the hospital. So looking at this top half here, I thought this was a really clean layout. I really liked the comprehensive overview of the trend of overall rating. I thought that his use of this line chart right here was really great. Goes from 2014 to 2022. But one thing that he did here that others did not was he entirely excluded the axes and chose to instead just use specific data labels for each point. So we kind of get away from that problem that we saw with a couple of other entries where it looks like there's a large drop off because there's a non-zero axis, but he kind of removed that from the equation here. And so, he does kind of point out that there was a drop in scores. You can see this noticeable decline in the overall rating, but his line chart does reflect a minimal change here. One thing I would like to kind of say is that this map visualization does take up a lot of very prime real estate. It's right in the center of the page, and I'm not exactly sure that it adds enough value to take up that amount of space. So that is just one thing that I would kind of consider for the future. Moving on to that second half of his visualization, I thought really great use of the 100% stacked column chart. I think it showed a fairly consistent proportion of these promoters, which is in blue, and then showed kind of a decline in that promoters score in 2021 and then again in 2022. I also thought that this heat map was a great choice. One of the things that I think we often believe is that when we're using this color-coded system to kind of represent differences, that additional data labels aren't exactly necessary, but I do think that Gabriel made a good call here. You'll see that because he's comparing each of these different measures across years, the context of exact percentages is really helpful. So if we look at, for instance, care transition and the cleanliness of hospital environment, in 2019, you can see that they both have the same color, the same shade of blue, but the care transition was at a 54%, whereas cleanliness of hospital environment was at 76%. So giving us, that kind of more exact measurement helps see that even though they're the same color, there is almost a 20 percentage point difference here. So I think that that was really good addition on his part. And then finally, in these insights and recommendations, I think he did a really great job of tying everything together. So I really appreciated that he kind of called out those top 3 measures that had the lowest proportion of top box answers, which were care transition, communication about medicines, and quietness of hospital environment. And then he also provided recommendations that directly correlated to those 3 measures. So I thought that was a really great approach. So really in general, when considering the challenge prompt, I think that he focused primarily on what recommendations can you make to the hospital to help further improve the patient experience. And I think that his insights and recommendations really clearly answered that question for us with this challenge entry. So this was a really compelling visualization to walk through. I thought it was a really great representation of the data, and I really enjoyed being able to kind of walk through it. So thanks, Gabriel.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Damon Woolsey's entry, and Damon seems to be a name that's coming up more and more on these meetings of ours. And what we have here is actually a fully developed research paper that he laid on us. So I've been on a challenge team for a while now, and I can confidently say that I didn't see something quite like this up until this point. So in Damon's own words, he had no previous knowledge on the topic that we shared the data on. So what he did is basically he went and got some. If you check the About Us section of the project, he firstly researched the role. So he went out, found a ton of resources on what an actual AHA analyst would do in his role. He then also educated himself on the AHA itself, American Hospital Association, and all of this to create the sort of like a framework in which he's only to begin his analysis. So as you can see, he shared quite a lot of these resources. And now that he sets all of that up, he starts the usual analysis workflow, right? So he introduces us with what he did in data cleaning and processing. Here, I'm going to have to nitpick a little bit. And while I do appreciate showcasing technical knowledge in this case of Excel formulas, the reality is that without the stakeholders knowing what data lives in those cells, in those cell references or columns or tables, these really don't have any meaning. So I think excluding them would probably save up some space, and I don't see them adding any real value here. That said, there are other things that he did really great, and one of those is replacing missing information. So he found some information missing from the state of Maryland, where he actually proposes two ways to go about sorting that out. In a real world scenario, he would reach out to the responsible parties for that data. In our scenario, he actually referenced the higher level data. And once he established the consistency of that data throughout the period in question, he just basically did an average of the data that he had at hand, which I think was really smart. It's I think reasonable enough assumption to do the imputation that way. By far and away the piece that I like the most here is this sentence. So analyzing the data was an iterative process wherein my exploration informed my research, and then my research informed my further exploration. So what this says is that he really went in with an open mind, right? So he didn't know anything, and he didn't have this preconception of what he was supposed to get at the end, and then just search for some sort of facts that confirm that. He was completely open-minded, and he just went with the flow. And I'm actually, if you go at the top of his work here, there's a link. This link leads to, and you will see in a second that I wasn't kidding with that when I said this was a research paper. So I'm going to open this, and hopefully it won't break on your screens. And this is what we see. So it's almost a book or a beginning of one. So we have the cover page, we have the table of contents, we have the introduction, all of which are self-explanatory. The background piece is where we are actually introduced with some of the workings of the survey itself. So here he gives the details like what categories of questions are asked, how many questions, the time frame, stuff like that. He even introduced some additional data and additional programs that he will reference later on in his discussion. Discussion is basically where Damon plays with our data, but he also draws heavily on the outside sources. Now, two things here. He does go quite wide outside of the scope of what we provide in the data. That's one. The other is this doesn't directly answer all of the questions we had in a challenge prompt. It is still extremely interesting. So he puts everything. He mentions no less than 4 outside studies that were done on this very subject throughout these 10 years. And this is quite actually verbose and quite long. Fortunately, he does draw conclusions. So, and they are quite bold, let me tell you. So the first conclusion is, unlike Yasmin, and I think we are going to mention this a little bit later. So Damon's conclusion is that the drop-off in the response rates can actually introduce bias in the results. So the second conclusion is, he calls out on a study that found that people actually tend to trust word of mouth more than they do HCAHPS results over the years. And finally, number 3 was, given the first 2 conclusions, the hospitals should really make an effort to somehow bind all of these findings together. So essentially, what this says is that in its present form, the HCAHPS isn't as relevant as it should be. Again, this is very, very detailed and goes maybe a little bit too far away from the main challenge prompt, but the amount of research that went into this is just amazing. So probably the best way for me to offer my own summary of this is that if you were somebody who has no knowledge on the subject at all, if you read through everything that Damon shared with us, you would be comfortable holding your own in any conversation on this topic. I think that there's nothing more to say than that.
I think what Cornelius does really well here is focus solely on the 4 questions asked in the challenge prompt. And from there, after defining a few KPIs, he dives into his thought process and logic behind answering each one of these questions with the data that was provided. So for example, if we want to see whether these scores have improved, well, first let's define how we're going to measure that improvement and then evaluate the outcome. So I will say though that I do think that his definition of improvement, which here is simply the difference between the satisfaction rate and the most recent results compared to the first results, leaves out a lot of context, especially since satisfaction rates had improved almost every year, and we can actually see it here, up until COVID, which is this drop-off. But he doesn't really mention COVID anywhere, which we could actually see it in Yasmin's regression analysis did, significantly impact the results negatively. But I would still really like kind of his approach, and ultimately I think this visual works really well. Mostly though, I like how he answers the next question, which is, are there any specific areas where hospitals have made more progress than others using this quadrant analysis? And I think a lot of people used quadrants. This is a little bit different, for example, than what Yasmin did. And what he's doing here is, even though it looks like none of the areas have actually improved, these which are in the green here are at least the most salvageable, since they have the highest satisfaction rates and they have barely dropped over time or after COVID. And I actually think this red quadrant right here answered this next question really well, which is, are there any major areas of opportunities remaining? Since in the opposite case, they have low satisfaction rates and they have dropped significantly lately. But Cornelius didn't actually use this to answer that question. He really just did a chart of the satisfaction rates, which is a bit of a missed opportunity, I think, since he already had that there. And I think it, removes one extra chart, but helps kind of tell the same story and tie the improvements with the areas and opportunities in a single visual. But this works really well too, especially since care transition, which was yellow here, is the one with the lowest satisfaction rate overall. So fair enough. But overall, go back up, I think this report really does accomplish what it sets out to do quite well. And all of the visuals are very clear and effective. There's a lot of good database best practices employed here. I do think, though, with a few minor tweaks in the approach, it could have been even better. But great work, as usual, from Cornelius. So that's actually all the finalists. Now, before we move on to the selection process, I do want to quickly recap the challenge prompt and the criteria. So participants were expected to evaluate whether the HCAP survey has been successful in creating incentives for hospital to improve their quality of care. That really was just the main purpose. The questions that we did ask were to help kind of push the analysis along or give them avenues to get started. But really, and this is why I guess questions like these was added to the challenge prompt, because it wasn't strictly that, the the American Hospital Association was looking to precisely answer these four. They just wanted, to evaluate whether they were accomplishing these goals. And these questions do help. So fair play to anyone that just used these four, but I don't think it necessarily has to be a knock on anyone that took different avenues to eventually do this same evaluation. And final thing, remember that we're judging each entry in terms of a complete project. So every element on the project page plays a part, not just the visuals or report or the dashboard itself. So having said that, does anyone have any strong initial preferences?
I've really got to stick up for my guy Yasmin here. I loved his analysis from top to bottom.
Yeah, I was gonna vote for him as well. Obviously, previously Yasmin was a person who was known for mostly great visualizations. So he won actually a challenge before with a very unique and distinct style. But this time around, he went really, really heavy with the technical side as well. And for me personally, the best part, because my statistics is as old as my college, it was really easy for me to read through it, reading through it. So I'm not a completely non-technical person, but I'm not as proficient as some of you guys. And the fact that I was able to just comprehend all of it speaks to how clearly he laid everything out.
I'll just add on that I really liked how he used MPS, because I think that top box predictor name is kind of confusing, but NPS in the business world, like, people know what that is. So I thought that was a really nice way to just make it more understandable.
I also thought that Yasmin's was really good, but I also, Enrique, you kind of convinced me with Cornelius's. I think that kind of walking through each of those charts and explaining and kind of diving in was a fantastic use of space. And I think that he also, had some really great characteristics in his as well. So I would put that up for, a potential too.
Yeah, I like that one as well. I think Cornelius did a great job of having a full dashboard, but I think it's a good best practice for other people to follow, to break apart the different elements in there and place them within the context of when you're talking about it, to help kind of illustrate the point that you're making along the way. So I think he did that really well. I agree with the thoughts on Yasmin too. I actually think, and I might be wrong here, but this is the most visuals we've actually seen him use. To me, I think he always kind of sold us on his very creative and unique storytelling, which I think, if I remember correctly from his Leica entry on the Space Challenge, I think he had maybe one chart on there, but it was mostly, or just numbers really.
No, he had 0 charts and won the challenge. Yeah, that was really, that was fantastic.
Yeah, I will also say that I really liked this chart in Gabriel. I think maybe his full entry isn't as strong as others, but I think it was interesting for me to read that his conclusion was that it had been successful in meeting the goal that we were trying to evaluate here. Most people said the opposite because of the COVID drop-off, but I think I would actually agree with his evaluation that it was being successful. And I think this visual pays that off the best, because we had a lot of people do the line chart and the drop-off, and you could see the positive trend here. But I think this really shows that after the first few years here, every metric was improving almost, except for maybe quietness of hospital environment. And then COVID hit, and naturally that caused problems for hospitals and patients everywhere. So I thought that was a really interesting way of just seeing well, I think we actually were improving. And then, the whole world was hit with an unfortunate situation that naturally affects scores. What I gather, though, it looks like maybe Yasmin and Cornelius would be the two kind of picks for the voting for the winner. Or does anyone have any objections, any other ideas?
Yeah, I don't want to add oil to the fire, but I sort of really like Marianne's work. But specifically the categorization of the KPIs and the fact that she broke them out. We saw a lot of people just bundle all of the measures together, even though the measures are actually hierarchical. So we have these overall measures, which are like willingness to overall rate and overall score and willingness to recommend. And then we have these measures that specifically measure a certain aspect of a facility, cleanliness, quietness, stuff like that, communication, stuff like that. Not a lot of people broke those out, but then we are still Yasmin and one of the three people.
Yeah. It's also, I guess, worth calling out Damon's Sentry as well because of how just unique it is. And it's funny, at first I thought, does this really qualify almost as like a challenge entry? Because we usually ask for, reports or dashboards, but funnily enough, like that wasn't part of the challenge prompt this time. We were just asking them to evaluate, the survey's success and then just present that to, the American Hospital Association. So I think this actually works really well and it's kind of like it's relevant. I will say though, I felt like his conclusions were tied mostly to conclusions that he found in his research, more so than what he found in the data himself, which for me, I think that's what separates him a little bit, maybe from the finalists within the finalists here.
I was gonna say the same thing. I love the fact that he went all out. So challenge aside, okay, you may win, you may not win. That aside, I love the fact that he just created this open-ended process which led him all over the place. And yeah, he does draw on a lot of outside research, and it's all over the place. It's from 2010, 2013, 2019. So looking at it, it's definitely unique. Looking at it from that perspective, it may just go a little bit too much outside of what we asked for, in terms that it wouldn't be okay that he had this privilege and everybody else didn't, because we didn't explicitly say so. So while I'm personally a fan, I would agree that probably in this round he doesn't go to the final vote.
All right. So I think, are we happy then with Yasmin and Cornelius, or do we go Yasmin, Marianne? Does anyone?
I'll say, so my order would be number 1 is Yasmin, and then I really like Gabrielle's. I just feel like that heat map visual was the best visualization of this challenge because it's just one that you see immediately and it draws you in and you just know what's happening. So that would be my vote.
That's fine. Chris, Rule, any thoughts?
I'm pretty torn. I think this is, as always, we just have such a good crop of finalists here. I've basically been convinced each time each one of you has suggested one of the others as a finalist, so I really don't have much to add. They're all different in their own great ways, and they all bring some unique insights to the table, so I don't have any thoughts.
I'm gonna go ahead and stick up to for Gabrielle. I thought that heat map was really, I think, like kind of like you said, it showed exactly what he intended it for it to show, but it also, I think all of his decisions to use the heat map to begin with, to use, percentages within the boxes, I think that was just a really, really great way to show exactly what he intended. So, I will throw my vote that way in terms of as one of our finalists.
Fair enough. I will also say for his and Yasmin's, I think they didn't make any of the average mistakes. And another common theme that we found, which wasn't as, I'll call it big of an error, but a lot of people plotted on the x-axis the release year versus the actual like reported time frame that the results were from, which I think, in my opinion, is the correct year to use for the x-axis, which is what we're seeing here. That's why it's 2014 to 2022. You'll see another 2015 to 2023, which would when the results were released, but not when the actual surveys were completed. So, okay. Sounds then like we've got Yasmin and Gabriel as the 2 finalists that we'll be voting on for the winner. So if everyone's ready, we'll do Yasmin 1, Gabriel 2. All right. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, I had a feeling this would happen. But yeah, it looks like Yasmin takes it 5-0. Congratulations. Second time winner. We've got very few of those. I think maybe only Zoe Douglas and Gerard Duggan. Branislav, you can correct me if I'm wrong, have been the
I don't
two-time
think
winners
you
so
are.
far. Yasmin, you are now our third, so congratulations. Let's give them a round of applause. So as a prize, you'll be taking home a free annual membership to Maven Analytics, a $100 Amazon gift card, I think a Visa gift card, and a custom Maven Challenge winner t-shirt, which Gerard and Zoe don't have, so there you go. Congratulations. But that's it for this challenge. Thanks once again to everyone that continues to participate. We've got a lot more in store for you guys, a lot more t-shirts to give away, Gerard. So stay tuned, and thanks everyone.